So thank you for checking out our video from the AAS Committee on Academic Advancement, discussing basic principles of what to look for when negotiating your first job, as well as renegotiating or changing jobs. So this talk is really going to go over three basic points. One, general points to think about when negotiating any job. Number two, specific points related to choosing your first job, what to look for and what to ask for. And finally, when you've been in your job for a while and it's time to change, how do you renegotiate or change jobs to make your situation better? So to begin with, some general principles when thinking about jobs. It's really important to prioritize what is most important to you. If you want to be someone who is writing grants and producing papers, presenting at meetings, or if you want to be someone who's really growing an active and robust clinical practice, your priorities are going to be very different in terms of what you ask for and what you should expect from your institution. Related to this is the idea of controlling your time. It's really important and very helpful to have a predictable schedule, set clinic days, block OR time that allows you to plan your week, whether it's getting ready for clinic, preparing cases, or sitting down to write a grant or a paper. If you know which days you're going to be busy and which days you have dedicated free time, it makes it a lot easier to plan your schedule, as well as arrange meetings with collaborators who can help you or mentors who can help you accomplish the goals that you set out for your program. Along these lines, it's very important to also have good administrative or clinical support, particularly administrative assistant. When you're busy running ORs, building your practice, getting your research program off the ground, the last thing you want to do is spend hours on email chains trying to figure out when people are free for meetings, booking tickets for yourself, and things like that. So it's helpful to have an administrative assistant who can do all that for you, someone you can trust to manage your calendar, set up appointments, so you can really focus on the clinical and science aspects of your job. It's also potentially helpful if you can get access to an NP or a PA to help on the clinical side. This isn't always possible as you start a practice, but it never hurts to ask. You can set it up as something that you can get down the road if you hit certain metrics. If you're negotiating for research time, if you're someone who's interested in building a clinical, basic, or translational research program, you have to make sure to negotiate for the amount of time that you need and the resources you need to make that successful. So keep in mind, in today's research environment, it's probably going to be anywhere from 3 to 5 years before you get your first big independent grant to fund your program. So you're going to need some kind of funding and resources, both in terms of personnel, equipment, software, space, and so on from your program for at least the first 2 to 3 years in order to get some momentum on your research program. And you have to keep in mind that there will be a lot of pressures from the institution to be active clinically, since that's what pays the bills ultimately for the institution. So in order to meet your clinical productivity goals, to do enough cases to grow your practice, and also keep the institution happy, having protected time, having financial resources, money to spend for things, and personnel support to actually do the research and keep it going while you're in the clinic in the OR is absolutely essential to make it work. In terms of compensation, a lot of times it's pretty standardized within the institution or across institutions, so there may not be a whole lot of room to negotiate your salary, but again, it never hurts to ask. You can always check and see. If you bring more to the table than the average applicant, it might be worth asking for a little bit more upfront in terms of compensation. It's also really, really important to study the benefits that come with your position. So look at the insurance, the costs, look at retirement plans, whether there's matching funds or not, and how they protect the income that you're putting into those plans and what percentage they're willing to match and how they figure the matching. A lot of institutions also have tuition benefits. If you want to go to class to get an MPH or get a degree certificate, it's nice to know the institution has some sort of relationship with the School of Public Health or other institution so that you don't have to pay for tuition or don't have to build that into your grants in order to further your education. Finally, in terms of general principles, you want to think about what track you're slotted into for your program. So a lot of programs will have various tracks. They could be focused on clinical productivity, they could be focused on education, they could be focused on academic productivity, grants and papers. You need to think about whether the position is tenured or not and what that means, because often it means there's a time limit. You have X many years to achieve tenure, which means you have a certain number of years to hit the targets they have set to achieve promotion. And if you don't, you might have to leave the institution, or it might not become something, a situation you want to be in at that point. So it's important to ask, what are the different options for your track? What are the pluses and minuses of each one? And be very specific in terms of what are the expectations to get promoted for each of those tracks. So those are the general principles for thinking about how to negotiate any job, or what to think about when going into a job. Now we're going to pivot and focus more specifically on your first job. So you're fresh out of residency or fellowship. You're trying to figure out what type of job is best for you. And the easiest place to start is to identify what you want in a job. And again, it ties back to the first point from the previous slide. Are you going to be someone who wants to be really clinically busy? Are you going to be someone who wants to grow independently NIH or other funded research program, or some mix of the two? And that'll really help you figure out what your goals are for the job, which will help you identify the best place for you. In terms of application, you should think about reaching out through your mentors, who can often help you find jobs that might not be posted on, for example, the ACS or other society websites. So they can help you find jobs that you might otherwise not know about. If you're applying for other jobs, you should make sure to prepare your CV and a cover letter and reach out to as many people as possible to expand your options. And again, it makes sense to have someone, a mentor or someone more senior in your department or division, take a look at your CV and cover letter and say, hey, is this something that actually works? Do I need to change it in some way to make myself more competitive for this job? You're also going to, at some point, interview, and there's going to be a breakdown between a first and a second interview most of the time. So your interviews are trying to make information flow both ways. So the institution wants to learn about you. Are you as good in real life as you seem to be on paper? And you're trying to find out about them. You want to know, what are the faculty like? Are they going to help you? Are they going to be competitors? Are they people who successfully worked with young faculty in the past? You want to know how the community works. Is this a community where you're going to be happy living either by yourself with your family? There's schools for your children that are easily accessible and of good quality and affordable. Is there daycare if you have young kids? What are the available support? And try to figure out what might be missing in terms of your needs in that job and how you could potentially address that. And to really make that work, you need to really systematically sit down and list what are the things you absolutely need to be successful, and a list of 100% important things that you just couldn't accept the job without, and also list the things that you want. And these are things that would be really helpful. They could help you accomplish your goals, but they aren't deal breakers. So if you don't get those things right now in your first offer, you can still be happy in the job and eventually work your way towards reaching those goals. And again, that falls under the category of things like protected time, research funding, administrative assistants, physician assistants, or nurses, and so on. When you're doing all this, it's also important to know the market. How many people out there offer the same things that you do, and how many institutions are looking for people like you. And that's going to have a pretty significant effect on what you can get from the institution. If there are 100 people who could fill this job, you're not likely to get a whole lot. If you're the only person who can fill that job and meet the exact needs of the department, then you have a much stronger negotiating position to work with. It's also important to understand the market in the sense of what's your competition. So if your salary is going to be dependent on how many RVUs you produce in a few years, you want to know what the market share of the institution is, who are the competing institutions, and what is your institution going to do to help you grow your practice and compete with anyone else who offers the same clinical services within that region. In terms of compensation, you can look it up. The AAMC Faculty Salary Report book is available online. It's a nice guide to let you know that the offer from your institution is fair or not, and how much room you have to negotiate up in terms of your salary. You have to think about, obviously, this varies somewhat by region to region, so you have to consider the cost of living in your particular region, but in general, this is a pretty nice guide for what you should be thinking about. In terms of that track we talked about before, thinking about tenure versus non-tenure, you want to know how successful faculty have been at being promoted, what they did to get promoted, and if possible, it's always helpful to ask to see if you can see someone's tenure packet for a successful application to give you a sense of what you really needed to succeed. You're ultimately, hopefully, going to get a contract from the institution and an offer letter laying out exactly what they expect of you and what they're willing to offer you. It can be helpful to have a lawyer take a look at that. Sometimes they'll notice language that you're going to miss that could favor either you or the institution in particular ways. And quite frankly, a lot of physicians aren't all that legal savvy, so it's easy to miss things that can come back to bite you later. So it is probably worth the fee of having a lawyer take a good look at the contract and highlight specifically areas of concern and where the language might not necessarily favor you as much as you might think. Now, the trade-off of that is most of these contracts and offer letters are pretty standard, so there may not be a whole lot of room to negotiate in an academic setting. In private practice, there's often some more room. But even in that setting, it tends to be fairly standardized. But still, overall, it's worth knowing what you're getting into, and a lawyer can really help you with that. And finally, set goal points through the contract time. Think about where you want to be at the end of each year and at the end of the contract, and then share that with your leadership. It helps to know that what you expect for your job and what you hope to accomplish is the same as what your employer hopes. And one easy way to accomplish this is sit down and ask your chairman or your division chief at the time of the interview, say, hey, imagine 2-3 years from now, you and I are sitting down for my annual performance review, and we're hitting it out of the park. I've done everything that you wanted me to do. We hit every possible goal that you could lay out. Now, could you tell me what that time period looks like? So tell me, what would a complete home run look like in 2 or 3 years from your standpoint when you hire me? And that really helps them lay out to you what are the precise expectations. Do they want you to come off of your salary guarantee by year number 2? Do they want you to hit X RVUs by year number 1? Do they want you to submit 5 grants and 10 papers by the end of the first year? Be very, very explicit. And it really helps just to lay it out in the open. If they know what your expectations are and you know what their expectations are, then they're much less likely to have misunderstandings down the road, and you're both going to be a lot happier with that situation. Again, along those lines, if your goals, to reiterate the point, if your goals are to build a clinical or research program and you're going to ask for particular resources, a nurse or financial support or computer or lab space, one helpful thing you can do when asking for that stuff is have a plan in place for what you're going to use it for. And don't be vague, be very specific. So if you're going to ask, for example, you want $100,000 a year for research support, it's hard to go in and say, I just want this. It's a lot better for you to say, I want this money because I'm going to hire these people to do these things. I will apply for grants 1, 2, and 3 at these times over the first year, the second year, and the third year. And that way they know exactly what you're going to deliver for that money. If they're going to put the money in your account so you can use it, it's much more helpful from a negotiating standpoint to say, I'm asking for this and this is what I'm going to do with it. And that way they're more confident you have a plan in place. And imagine you're just writing a grant. It's helpful to come to these interviews with an Ames page or a grant or a chart laying out exactly what you're going to apply for, when you're going to do it, and what you need to hit those targets. So that, again, ties back to the idea of laying out goals together and knowing exactly what you need to accomplish those goals. And it's very helpful to review all of this with one of your mentors or colleagues before going in to say, hey, is this something that's realistic? Am I asking for too much? Am I asking for too little? Should I specify things more precisely or less precisely? How is this conversation going to go, do you think, if you were the person hiring me? It's just like anything else you do in surgery. You practice it before you do it, and that way you deliver a solid final product. So, we've talked about general principles for jobs. We've talked about what to do specifically for the first job. So now think down the road. You've had your first job, you've been successful, but you're either getting ready to move up to something bigger, you want something more from your institution, or there's something that you're not satisfied with the job that you have now. So now it's time to renegotiate or change jobs. And the first step in this process is really identify the shortcomings or the problems with your current job. So if you don't know what's wrong, you aren't going to be able to either ask the institution to fix it or go to another place and figure out what you can do better to succeed. So is it a person? Is it a process? Are you just having bad luck? Are you not happy with the way your clinical practice is growing? Be very specific in knowing what is the exact problems that you want to overcome from your current job and how to fix it. It's also important to know your market. Just like when you're applying for your first job, it doesn't make sense to jump out of job, even if it's not your favorite, unless you're in a favorable market for being hired, because then you'll end up something worse. If you're going to get a contract from a new job, again, just like the first time around, make sure a lawyer looks at it. If you're looking at a new institution, it's helpful to understand how that institution is structured. You've probably gotten pretty familiar with the place that you are working at currently. You know the organizational chart, who is above you in the hierarchy, who you report to, and who are the people that work for you. You're probably not going to know that as well for the new institution you might be looking at. So it's useful to figure that out. If you can get an organizational chart to show yourself where you fit in the scheme of things, to look at the web pages for that institution to figure out what their goals and what they're aiming for their institution. Look at people who currently work at that institution and figure out what have they accomplished. Are they people who are like you or not? Have they accomplished the things you want to accomplish or not? Because that will help you understand if the environment is going to be favorable for your success and whether it's worth it to leave the job you have currently. You also want to set measurable goals. Again, just like getting your first job, if you're going to move on to something or ask for something new from your institution when you're renegotiating, it's important to have very specific goals in mind so you know what to ask for in order to actually be successful. And finally, remember, you may have a lot of great ties to your institution. You may have a lot of good friends and mentors and people you work with, but at the end of the day, it's okay to walk away and go on to something that's better for you. If you can get more from your institution, great. It's always nice to be able to go to your chairman or division chief and say, hey, I've had a great time working here, but these are the problems I'm encountering now. This is what I'd like to do to change that. And if the institution really can't offer that, you can leave with good feelings. You don't have to burn any bridges. It's okay to say, I'm sorry, I've had a great time working here, but this is not the best place for me anymore. I've got a great offer that's going to let me accomplish the things I want to accomplish. Thank you for the time that I've spent here, but it's time for me to move on to the next step. So those are some basic quick tips to think about for job applications, whether it's your first job, your second job, or however many jobs down the road. The general principles tend to be pretty much the same. The main points are to focus and figure out exactly what you want to change and what you need, and build a roadmap to get there, and that will help you make sure you ask for the right things, and make sure you understand the situation you're stepping into. Get as much information as you can about the people and the place, so you can really know this is a place that I'm going to fit into, and it's going to help me do what I want to do. Thank you for listening, and we wish you the best of luck on your future job endeavors.